Tort reform is a perennial issue on the legislative agenda in the United States at both state and federal levels. And one of the key and most highly contentious issues of tort reform has to do with punitive damage reform. Proponents of punitive damages reform, as we will hear more about tonight, I'm sure, argue that cite cases such as the $2.7 million jury award in the hot spilled coffee case, and argue that such awards are unjustified, they encourage litigation, and that they impair the competitiveness of American business and raise the cost of American products. Those who support the current traditional system for punitive damages cite cases and examples such as the Delcon Shield, the Ford Pinto, and toxic shock syndrome as examples of why punitive damages are necessary to deter and punish reprehensible behavior. Even the Supreme Court, which has repeatedly acknowledged the utility of punitive damages as a tool to deter and punish reprehensible behavior, has questioned whether punitive damages awards are running wild. So with that in mind, the proponents of tort reform at the state and federal level have suggested such things as more clearly defining the standard for awarding punitive damages, raising the burden of proof for awarding punitive damages, bifurcating the liability and damages portions of trials, remitting part of a punitive damages award to the state treasury, and as we're going to focus on tonight, capping punitive damage awards. Our participants, as John just introduced, are Mr. Howard Rudge, who's the Vice President General Counsel of DuPont, and Professor John Culhane, who teaches torts, advanced torts, and related subjects here at Widener. The format of the debate is that each participant will first give a 5-minute introduction. Then I will ask Mr. Rudge a question. He will have 5 minutes to respond. Professor Culhane will have 2 minutes to rebut the response. Then I'll ask Professor Culhane a question. He will have 5 minutes to respond. Mr. Rudge will have 2 minutes to rebut that response. We'll have another round of questions from me. Then each participant will ask each other a question with the same format. Each participant will then make a 5-minute closing statement, and then we'll have time for some questions from the audience. So with that introduction, Mr. Rudge.
Thank you very much. Pleasure for me to come out and talk to people who are beginning their trek to be lawyers. I've been a member of the bar for 36 years. I believe in the civil justice system. I defend it with my full enthusiasm. However, I have to say that it could be substantially improved. I was down with the ABA here a couple of months ago, and Roberto Ramos said that our system was the envy of the world. And I had to raise my hand and say, you haven't traveled very much, have you? Because everywhere I travel, especially in the business community, all my foreign colleagues say, please do not import your civil justice system into our country, England, France. So what's wrong with our civil justice system, and why have lawyers been unable to correct the abuses? I said this to the ABA also. The ABA is not a professional association because it cannot act against self-interest. Both plaintiff lawyers and defendant lawyers have used the advocacy system to really line their own pockets. All these other countries seem to be able to settle disputes more efficiently, and they don't use the advocacy system. The civil system in Europe is really quite effective. You know, I said in the state legislature here recently, when one of our representatives said he would defend the jury system to the end, I said, do you realize that only in Canada is the only other English-speaking country that allows juries in a civil trial? Think about that. We're the only ones that allow juries in a civil trial. All the others relegate them to only criminal trials. Well, obviously, lawyers, if they're lining their own pockets, the last thing they want to do is make an efficient civil justice system. You know, the world sends, around the world, every day we send about $2.5 trillion. We do that in very complex financial transactions. And the cost of sending that money around the world is 0.003%. That's the cost. However, we have a slip and fall in the Hotel DuPont. It takes me 4 years to resolve it. And I have to pay a couple $100,000 to my own lawyers just to defend us in the civil justice system. I say I only have 2 minutes to go, so let me sum up what's wrong with the punitive damage system. The problem with the punitive damage system is it's not a deterrent. I don't know how we ever sold society that it was a deterrent, but we managed to do a great job. It is punishment. It is not a deterrent. Why is it not a deterrent? By the time you get through a punitive damage trial, which is 4 or 5 years after the conduct, the people who did the conduct are long gone. The only people who pay for punitive damages are the stockholders, the employees, and the consumers. The consumers, because all of the cost of the punitive damage system goes into higher prices for products. The employees, because as soon as a company gets hit, like Dow Chemical is currently getting hit with breast implant, first thing they have to do is reduce costs. They're going to lay off employees. And the stockholders, of course, they're the ones that take it right in the head. And they're innocent. They're pensioners, they're women, they're minorities, they're us. So why in the world do we have a punitive damage system? And what is it really accomplishing? I'll say one other thing about cats, and then I have to sit down. Basically, our entire system in punishment has never allowed unlimited punishment. You go into a criminal trial, you might get the death penalty, you might get life imprisonment, you might get so many years, but before you do the conduct, you pretty well know what your punishment's going to be. However, in a civil case, punishment is unlimited. I had a case down in Zapata County, Texas, and it was conducted in Spanish. It was the DuPont company against a Mexican national. You know what's the worst thing you can hear when you're trying a case down there? When the jury comes back and says, how many zeros are there in $1 billion? That really gets your attention.
What I'd like to do is welcome you to McDonald's in a sense, because I think that case really provides a good illustration of why punitive damages are a good thing, not a bad thing, even though it's the case that's typically trotted out by the opponents of punitive damages as everything wrong. And let me tell you a little bit about the stuff you probably know already, and then I'd like to turn to the stuff that you may not know, or certainly the stuff that got less publicity. So we have this woman who is scalded by McDonald's coffee, and she recovers, at least initially, $160,000 in compensatory damages and a pretty tidy $2.7 million in punitive damages. Okay, what else about this case makes it seem, from kind of an initial standpoint, sort of unappealing to the plaintiff's side? Well, everybody knows coffee is hot, right? So where's the tort there in the first place? And you probably heard also that the plaintiff was sitting in a car seat trying to open up the lid of the coffee. The car wasn't moving, I should add, but she was, doing this in probably sort of a precarious way. Although one could ask, why serve coffee to drive-out window if you're not expecting to be opening it in the car? But in any event, not the most sympathetic set of facts, and widely, and I think certainly effectively used in the media as what's wrong with punitive damages. What about the things you didn't hear? Well, there had been some 700 plus complaints that had been made against McDonald's for the heat of its coffee, a subject that will go on in a moment. And McDonald's had paid out already something like $500,000 in settlements to plaintiffs in these cases. Second, of course, coffee is hot, but there's hot, and then there's the boiling point of water. And this coffee was 180, 190 degrees. I seem to recall from my chemistry class that the boiling point of water is 212. The boiling point of coffee might be a little different. I wasn't covered in the course, but presumably this coffee was pretty close to boiling times. Most other restaurants, most fast food places keep their coffee at about 150, 160. You at home would probably have it about 130, 140. It makes a big difference. This woman received third-degree burns. In an article in Consumer Report, it was stated that to keep the coffee at 180, 190, you get optimal taste, but also, unfortunately, optimal burn potential. Well, why wasn't the consumer at least warned about this sort of excessive heat? And part of the problem in the case was McDonald's counsel at trial saying things like, well, we thought about warning, but there are more serious things in restaurants. One might suffer, and didn't think it was worth, or sort of expressed McDonald's position, it wasn't worth doing anything about. The plaintiff in this case had been willing to settle for some $20,000, but McDonald's had offered her only a few $100s. Not enough to compensate her for the injuries she actually suffered. In fact, the attorney compounded the problem by saying that she wouldn't have been so seriously burned had she not been so darn old. She was 81 years old, and sort of in defiance of the Finskull plaintiff rule, the court, the jurist pitched to the jury that this was sort of an unusual case because of her age. Well, so what? One more thing you should know is the $2.7 million, so far from this idea of being plucked out of the air, represented about 2 days' worth of profit McDonald made on the sales of its coffee alone, and nothing else, worldwide. So why had McDonald's not done anything in the past? The truth is it was cheaper to go on doing things the way they had been doing them, settling the cases, continuing to compel franchisees, by the way, not giving franchisees the option, but compelling them to sell coffee at this high temperature. And only the 1-2 punch of punitive damages and the attendant PR even makes companies take notice of this sort of thing. How about the level of misconduct, okay? The jury found, as it was required to find in punitive damage cases, that the conduct had been willful, reckless, malicious, and wanton, okay? Is this consistent with the kind of conduct we typically find in these cases? Yes. In Delaware, for example, the court says what's necessary to support an award of punitive damages is the I don't care sort of attitude. New Jersey court says actual malice, reckless disregard of consequences. So we're not talking about typical negligence cases. We're talking about cases in which the conduct is outrageous.
Question for you. Whenever you're ready. Okay. If you cap punitive damages awards, won't it simply make punitive damages then another cost of doing business that businesses can plan for and build into the cost of their products?
I find it just unbelievable that anyone would think that people would engage in reckless, what was the word there? Reckless,
I'll be back in a minute. Willful, reckless, malicious, and wanton.
Yeah, I have trouble thinking that McDonald was willful, whatever. But to think that people sit there and say, how can we engage in this conduct so that we can plan that kind of a punitive damage award into our business? I mean, it's ludicrous. If you think that punitive damages are a deterrent, that's just illogical. If punitive damages were a deterrent, how come we've had punitive damages for 25 years? How come we don't have less punitive damage awards today than we had back there 25 years ago? They just keep on going up. Simple reason, it's not a deterrent. Punitive damages are designed because lawyers can figure out those words and convince a jury that normal conduct is wanton, reckless, etc. Cap of damages would do nothing more than give you certainty that when you go into a courtroom, you're not going to get your entire corporation going down the tubes.
Yikes, where do I start? There are case after case after case have shown that in situation after situation, corporations have engaged in this kind of calculus of risk. The Ford Pinto case is the one that comes to mind, where the Ford high-rise, this was borne out in litigation that the car would continue to explode if rear-ended and cause all kinds of damage, but figured out that it was cheaper to pay off the settlements, pay the tort plaintiffs than it was to redesign. The only thing that was effective in that case was to impose punitive damages, which made it more expensive for Ford to engage in this kind of behavior. So I think, I hate to think this of people, but I think in case after case, it's been, I shouldn't say case after case, in a few of the most egregious cases, to be fair, such evidence has been forthcoming. If punitive damages are not a deterrent, then I would suggest the solution is, more and better punitive damages. That's like saying the criminal law is not a deterrent, we should do away with it. It's not working as a deterrent. What we need to do is make it effective, make it work more efficiently. So that argument makes no logical sense to me. Punitive damages, this idea of punitive damages going up and up and up is contradicted by a number of studies. I mean, sort of anecdotally, it's easy to say punitive damages going up, but I have 3 studies here. I certainly can't do this in my rebuttal, but I've hoped to get to it in the substance of my next response, which show punitive damages are awarded in only a very small percent of cases. 3 different studies: product liability 3%, product liability 2%, product liability in only 355 cases over the last, from 1965 to 1990, an average of 15 nationwide per year. So, to my way of thinking, the problem in terms of punitive damages is not solved by doing away with them, but sort of making them operate more efficiently. With respect to caps, I sort of agree. I think our real debate here is about whether to have them or not. I think the caps make no sense because caps don't really serve the purpose of punitive damage.
Okay, I have a question for you now, Professor Culhane. Are judicial restraints on punitive damages sufficient, or do we need legislative restraints?
Well, I suppose in theory there could be a world in which legislative restraints might work. The problem I have with them is they can't predict what's going to happen in a particular case. Okay, that's why a civil justice system is in place sort of initially. I mean, if you really thought that the civil justice system wasn't working, then that's equally true for compensatory damages as much as punitive. We have juries, we have courts to assess on a case-by-case basis the kind of damage, and in punitive damage context, the level of deterrence necessary to make the corporate defendant, or individual defendant, by the way, these are not all corporate defendants, stop engaging in the conduct that was either intentional, willful, or reckless. And by the way, as I said, it's important to keep our eye on the ball here. The only cases in which punitive damages can be awarded, and I'm aware of no exception to this, is in cases in which the conduct is negligent or even grossly negligent, but reckless, bordering on willful, intentional. So it's only the court that's got the full benefit of factual development that's in a position to make the assessment as to whether or not punitive damages are warranted. In terms of caps, which I think is the second part of the question, it seems to me you set up a cap, for example, of $350,000 or 5 times compensatory and pick the greater of those two. That makes no sense to me at all. If punitive damages are going to work, the damages have to sting in some way. And the damages won't sting if you limit them to $350,000 if McDonald's is making $2.7 million in 2 days on coffee sales. That just doesn't do the job punitive damages were intended to do. Now, what kind of supervision can courts exercise? Supreme Court has come up in a number of difficult punitive damages cases with a series of guidelines to be applied. The first is clear instructions to the jury about the standard of conduct necessary to trigger punitive damages in the first place. The second is for the court and the jury, sort of at both levels, to take into account one, the amount of punitive damages necessary to make the payment sting the defendant. Secondly, how bad the conduct was. Third, now this is an important fact I think that typically a legislature would not or could not have in mind, which is how likely are future cases involving the same misconduct, okay? Because we don't want to give all the punitive damages to the first plaintiff, because then you have nothing for anybody else. And I am concerned about the problem of multiple punitive damages for the same conduct. That does not seem to be fair. So it's only a court that can assess the full situation that really is in a position to make those kinds of assessments. And finally, the third part of the Supreme Court's guideline really involves appellate review. One thing I did say about the McDonald's case, because I'm more of a chatterbox, that I realized was that the trial court knocked the damages down in that case to, I think, $480,000 total, including punitive compensatory. And by the way, I disagree with that, because that did not make McDonald's sort of set up to take notice to the extent it should have. But this is just one example. You know, the stuff you don't hear. Everybody heard about the $2.7 million, and no one heard about the $480,000 to which the trial court remitted the damages, and the parties subsequently settled for an undisclosed amount, believed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $600,000. So you know, it really is important to sort of recognize, one, the level of conduct necessary to trigger punitive damages, and two, the court's ability, as it does throughout the tort law, to sort of find a solution that best comports with the tort's policy of deterrence and compensation. So.
Well, I could say a lot about that. Let me say that my greatest worry is that the courts are failing, and I think punitive damages are a part of why they're failing. But if you look at what is happening in industry, and if you look at what's happening across the United States, private courts are springing up simply because society has lost confidence in our regular judicial system. Industry is getting together through CPR, and we're going to set up courts in California, Chicago, and somewhere here on the East Coast. We'll use retired judges. There will be a Federal Rules of Civil Procedure will apply. Both parties have to submit to the jurisdiction of this private court. And wonder, no punitive damages will be permitted. Part of the judges will be able to sanction parties, but they will not be able to sue for punitive damages. I get sued, and I have about 2,000 lawsuits against us across this country. I only have 6 in Europe, Asia, Pacific, and South America. But I do a lot of suing myself, and I love to sue. It's a great opportunity. I particularly love to sue the United States government. They are the biggest, mistake people I've ever come across. They really boggle things up. But I'll tell you, in every case I sue on the plaintiff side, I put in there a clause for punitive damage. Because if I can score big, I got big money coming. Now, to me, that's just really fostering the people to set themselves against each other, and it's all driven on greed. I don't buy this deterrence. It's all driven by greed.
The next question.
Yeah.
Exactly how bad is the problem? How significant is the punitive damages?
It's a serious problem. I'd say the biggest problem is the inefficiencies of our courts. I would put punitive damages in second place. I would put joint and several liability in third place. I would put the collateral source rule in fourth place. And I would put junk science in fifth place.
What happened to first place?
What's that? The first place is the inefficiency.
Oh, the inefficiency itself. I thought those were examples. Okay.
It just costs too much to litigate. And then I would go to punitive damages, joint and several collateral assault. And a real problem we've got today in our courts is the introduction of junk science.
I guess I'd like to respond both to the rebuttal and to the last comment since no time. But how bad is the problem? I don't know how we can assess this if we don't have sort of hard evidence in front of us. It may be the case that you've got more cases here than you have in Europe, but to me that's not an argument for doing anything. That just says we need to look at the kinds of cases, decide whether or not the plaintiffs in those cases really have a suit worthy of compensation. This really kind of misses the victims of these injuries, these problems. No one would argue that our system of civil justice is completely efficient, but that seems to me hardly an argument for doing away with it or moving to private courts. It seems like an argument for making it better, making it do its job more efficiently. With respect to how bad is the problem with punitive damages? Again, the only thing I can say in response to that is there are surprisingly few cases when you actually look at the numbers. I had occasion to do this in preparation for this debate and looked at 3 different studies which came to really the same conclusion with respect to products liability cases, which are usually cited as the biggest offenders. Not one study showed more than 3% of the cases in which punitive damages were awarded. Medical malpractice sort of hovered around the 3% mark as well. Now, I should say, in some of the cases when punitive damages are awarded, the awards have been quite high, but that's as it should be. Because again, it's the most egregious sort of conduct. And second, it's some kind of, I hope, deterrent for people to stop engaging in this sort of behavior. How efficient it is at doing that, I don't know. But if it's not efficient, it seems it's better to improve it instead of scuttle the system completely.
Professor Culhane,
Oh yeah. I don't have to stand yet.
what about the fact that punitive damage awards vary greatly among jurisdictions and also among different jury panels reviewing the same kind of conduct? Does that make punitive damages sort of a lottery for plaintiffs?
This is, the word lottery is one I hate, just like I hate the word tort reform, right? You say tort reform, it sounds as if tort should be punished and sent to reform school. You talk about punitive damage, lottery, and yes, there's some chance built into the system, but to call it a lottery makes it sound as if you just sort of spin the wheel and you get what you get. Again, these are tied to real specific findings about misconduct at the highest level of corporate management. So I don't think it's really sort of helpful to look at it in terms of a lottery. With respect to inconsistency between jury panels or from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, I guess I'd like to make 2 sorts of comments. One is that this is sort of a problem anytime you have a civil justice system. It may surprise you to learn that countries like Finland, Sweden, and Japan, which are more sort of ethnically homogeneous, for example, as opposed to the United States, have the same sorts of problems. You can get one panel in Scandinavia to say one thing, and the next panel can say something entirely different, and the same is even true in Japan. So I think that's kind of an issue that sort of cuts across cultural lines. And again, there's a little bit that's sort of healthy, I think, about the lack of certainty respecting the kind of reward or kind of results you might get in a particular case. Because again, in order to sustain an award for punitive damages, you're imagining a case in which the worst kind of conduct is engaged in, and you want the defendant to think there may be some jury out there that's going to sort of find out about this and to award a high level of punitive damages. So I think to some extent the uncertainty can operate in a beneficial way. If the uncertainties in a particular case or the inconsistencies in a particular case are too great, or the potential for that is too great, asbestos comes to mind, DES might have been a good candidate for this. The solution there is to do some kind of multi-district litigation to eliminate the potential for inconsistent results, I think, and not again to sort of say, well, since we have inconsistency, punitive damages are a bad idea. And again, I'm not saying in every case punitive damages have worked, well or as well as they could have. But the problem I see is that they're not good enough at deterring, not that they're too good a deterrent. And just in respect to one final comment, if you want to sort of stem frivolous lawsuits, what you do is you sanction attorneys who make a claim for punitive damages where they don't have any basis for doing it. It seems to me you've got civil procedure rules in place to allow you to do that sort of thing. And if courts were more courageous about applying those rules in some kind of consistent way, I think you might see a drop-off in the numbers of cases alleging punitive damages where it's not justified. Again, I think a lot of cases in which punitive damages are alleged, there's at least a good argument for it. One reform I am willing to, well, I use reform, you can't help it. One change I'm willing to go with in punitive damages is I do think there's something a little bit vertiginous, perhaps, about giving all of the punitive damages to the plaintiff. It seems like you've already compensated the plaintiff. And maybe it makes more sense after a certain amount of punitive damages has gone to the plaintiff as incentive to bring the suit to deed the rest of it over either to some kind of charitable organization or perhaps to the public treasury. I would prefer the public treasury only because then I think you avoid damages about which charity it should go to. And that could be a whole separate political battle, maybe not worth fighting.
We're having a dispute right before our eyes down in the state of Texas, as you know, John O'Quinn. I don't know if you know John O'Quinn? He's one of the big top gun trial lawyers, plaintiff trial lawyers. He's about to be disbarred, but he's down there, and he's the one that brought the tobacco lawsuit on behalf of Texas. They got $13 billion. And there was certainly a punitive claim in all of those cases on tobacco. He wants $2.3 billion as his fee for bringing that litigation. Governor Bush has claimed that the Attorney General had no right to enter into a contingency fee for punitive damages. And of course, he's suing the state of Texas now for his fee. The Attorney General has decided to resign over the issue. But let me show you the ridiculousness of punitive damages, what we've gotten ourselves into. And you kind of got to go to La La Land, to get the best example. And it's in California. And in California, they have Playboy clubs. They had 60 of them, and they were combined into one corporation. Some very bright plaintiff lawyers brought a class action suit against all 60 Playboy clubs in California, alleging that they were overcharging for their drinks. They got the class certified, and they had punitive damages in there. And this was the settlement. The settlement was that the lawyers got $3.5 million. And each member of all the 60 Playboy clubs got a chit for $1.50 to go in and buy their next drink at the Playboy Club. They would get $1.50 credit. The Playboy clubs promptly raised the dues by $3 per month to cover the loss of the $1.50. What did we achieve? What did we achieve? Thank you.
All right, this is the portion of the debate where the debaters ask each other questions. Professor Culhane, why don't you start by asking Mr. Rudge?
Well, I guess the question, I guess I could stand for all 15 seconds. I guess the question here is, given the problems you see in punitive damages, which I acknowledge some of them exist, how would you suggest we go about stanching sort of corporate maliciousness in the cases in which it arises, since the criminal justice system on itself is incapable of doing the job?
Well, I can't really say that there hasn't been corporate maliciousness. I'm not too sure it's as great a problem as you think it is. I mean, any corporation that wants to stay in business is not going to engage in reckless conduct and put some fraud over on their customers.
there's an awful lot of deterrence in this society against bad conduct. Now, if you want to have punitive damages and somehow you feel that's going to somehow deter us, I would say, I agree with you, I think, and I'm glad to hear you say that repetitive punitive damage is unfair. It's unfair for across the country to have 500 and 900 punitive damages for the same reason. But surely, I guess if you got to stick with the punitive damage concept, it just seems to me logical to have it capped so that at least there is some assurance going in that if you lose the case, you know what your damage is.
Professor Culhane, you have 2 minutes.
Well, again, I'm really against caps. I think the sort of better argument is do away with punitive damages completely. Because I think once you talk about caps, you kind of defeat the whole purpose of punitive damage, which is to deter, basically. It is somewhat a punishment, but it's also, to stop this from happening. And what might stop me from engaging in malicious behavior, $1.30, certainly is not going to work for McDonald's or for IBM or anybody like that. It's going to require a lot more, and it's too difficult to figure out in advance. Now, if you pitch the cap high enough, I might agree with you, but these caps are typically in the neighborhood of $200,000-$300,000. And by the way, that sort of a number, which is surfaced in a lot of jurisdictions, came from California, which had its own sort of special set of reasons for doing it. And I think the state legislature sort of uncritically adopted that figure and didn't quite give it much thought. And sort of tying it to compensatory damages makes no sense either, because they're serving a very different purpose, right? The purpose of compensatory damages is to make the plaintiff whole. The purpose of punitive damages bears no relation to that. So I don't see why you would do some kind of multiplier there. It seems what you should look at is how bad is the conduct, what's the necessary goal here of deterring it, and how much is going to be necessary for it to sting. The other thing I'd like to say about this is corporations will discount the probability of getting caught. In other words, a punitive damage system as it exists now operates so infrequently, so episodically, that it seems to me the smart move is still not to engage remedial behavior until you're caught, because the chances of actually getting the punitive damages based on the studies I've seen is practically zero. So I have some problems with one, respecting the cap, and two, I think it's important to recognize that people will I think, continue to sort of try and calculate this, even considering punitive damages do exist.
Could I ask them?
Oh yeah.
How about providing legislatively that lawyers cannot conduct any of their fees from punitive damage awards, and that we give the punitive damage award to the state to help taxation?
I like the second part of that a lot. I think not the whole. Well, I've never been a trial lawyer, so I have no particular action in mind here. I think that's perfectly obvious as I stand before you. But first, I think, as I said, I'm willing to sort of turn some of the amount over to the state. The problem if you turn it all over is this. There are many cases, think about the old cases from your torts class involving people spitting at other people, right? The compensatory damages in those cases are practically nil, right? So the only way the plaintiff has incentive to bring that suit, I think this is a suit that should be brought, is to award at least some punitive damages to the plaintiff. But I think after some point it does become surely a windfall. It exceeds all reasonable incentive effects. And I think that portion of it, and there I am willing to give the legislature some leeway in fixing the amount, saying beyond this amount or this percentage of the award, something like that, goes to the state. With respect to attorneys, I think you could impose some kind of similar formula. I haven't given this, I'll be honest with you, a lot of thought about exactly how you would do that, but it seems to me that lawyers striking the lottery in the sense of $2.3 billion because the corporation happened to do this thing. That really is the plaintiff's harm, not the lawyer's harm. I think does seem a little bit out of whack. So I'm not against that, at least in principle.
Mr. Edgemans respond?
Well, I'd like to ask a question. Do you feel that punitive damage is a very good concept? And let me give you as an illustration that the TMJ litigation DuPont got into, we sold $250,000 worth of Teflon to a entrepreneur who, working with the Methodist Hospital in Dallas, made a tubular jaw implant. Now, all of our literature said that we shouldn't use Teflon as a barrier substrate. We did. We put it in a couple thousand people, and it failed. And he promptly went bankrupt, and we all sued the DuPont company for being a raw material supplier to this thing, even though we had nothing to do with it. We won 300 and some cases. We've taken them all to the Court of Appeals. It had a total cost us of $60 million to defend ourselves in those two-people job implants. As a result, we have withdrawn all DuPont products from medical devices. We will not allow any DuPont product to go into human beings. Basically, because the human beings get to the point where if he dies for any reason, in old age, he will sue, and somebody causes his death. I see it really being a deterrent for innovation and creativity. And that's why all safety research really has gone over to Europe. The German car makers are fantastic at trying new safety devices. American car makers do not do that.
Am I supposed to be closing, responding, and
Why don't you
closing?
respond?
I'll respond. I wonder if at least their chewing gum didn't stick with Teflon. But anyway, I guess I think the problem you identify is a concern, but I don't think it's a concern specifically about punitive damages, because you're saying you won the cases even on a compensatory level, it sounds to me. And it seems to me there's a case there, especially since you provided explicit instructions about not using them for this purpose, that I can't imagine any court worth its salt, allowing the punitive damages claim to get sort of out of the box. So there's a case in which, maybe the courts weren't doing as good a job as they could. Whether or not the sort of heavy-handed tort liability is an impediment to innovation, sort of more generally, I think is a fair question. But that seems like a different debate to me. But yeah, sure.
Our profits from the $250,000 to $25,000. All right. Now, we have a $60 billion corporation. What corporation would risk all of its assets for $25,000 worth of profits? And that's why we withdrew from putting anything we can do.
Right. Well, the thing is, I guess you're sort of in a better position to make this argument. But it seems to me that if you talk about a pharmaceutical company, for example, and I'm a little bit more familiar here, the company will try scores of drugs in an attempt to find one that works. All kinds of research, all kinds of research money poured into different areas, and a lot of the stuff doesn't pan out. That doesn't mean they stop doing research, because when one does pan out and one doesn't have the sort of negative effects of causing all kinds of other problems, the pharmaceutical companies do quite well. And I don't see most of them going out of business.
Why the general counsel, or former general counsel, like Chuck Welch, his wife has gone senile, and he's pleading with me to bring in drugs from Japan because they will help her, but the FDA won't approve it. Why is experimentation with drugs going offshore?
Well, it certainly has in HIV, for example, where the FDA has a process that really sort of expedites. I mean, you're talking about a balance, and now we're sort of far from punitive damage, but what the hell? I think, because why not, right? I guess my response to that would be that there's a balance. I mean, the FDA wants to get reasonably good drugs to market as quickly as possible. On the other hand, a lot of these things are in such a preliminary state of development that the risks are there as well. And the FDA here is on the other side, and things go through and they end up doing more harm than good.
If I could just sort of
Shut us up.
point. Why don't we go to our conclusive statements so we'll have some time for questions from the audience. Mr. Rudge?
Well, it is balanced, I guess. I think punitive damage has gotten out of hand. I think they deter as much good conduct as they deter bad conduct. There is no relationship between punitive damages and compensatory damages. And actually, that's what caps are all about, is trying to give some reasonable relationship between compensatory damages and punitive damages. I think the system's got to be overhauled. I just don't think it's working. I'm particularly glad to see my opponent has at least agreed that the better punitive damages are a problem.
That's my final offer.
There's a bill down in Congress by Senator Orrin Hatch that will do that, and it seems to attract a lot of Democratic as well as Republican support, so maybe we will hitch the ball forward. I'm working in all 50 states to solve this problem. I really do believe it's a state problem. It's not a federal problem. And one of the worst states is Alabama. We're putting a lot of resources to try to bring Alabama into the 20th century. But, it's a matter of balance. It's a matter of balance, and we'll get the job done. Not the end of the world.
Well, I guess I would sort of summarize by basically tirelessly reiterating the same points I've made for the last hour. And basically it's this: there should not be a relationship between compensatory and punitive damages. I think that defeats the whole purpose of punitive damage, which is basically to deter. And the term you probably recall from punitive damages from your first year torts class is exemplary damages, to make an example of this defendant so others don't engage in the same kind of conduct. How effectively it's done, I don't know, and I would be the first to admit, not the first, but I would admit that punitive damages in some cases do go awry. You have some odd results, but if you trace those cases through, in case after case after case, those punitive damages have been knocked down, have been remitted in some substantial way, and it's only the only cases left standing are cases like the Exxon Valdez case, where I recall it was $5 billion in punitive damage, which you could say only hurts the stockholders. That was, I think, your first point, and that's a good point until you sort of roll it around a little bit and realize that there are all kinds of things that hurt the stockholders. If the company engages in fraud and the SEC catches them, that hurts the stock price, hurts the stockholders. When you invest in a stock, you take a certain risk that the conduct of people who are running the company is bad, either it's criminal or it's tortious or it violates SEC rules or anything like that, securities laws, that your stock price will go down. That's why with any luck you have a diversified portfolio, so no one is going to get you. And also, I think if the stock price does change, then it really gives incentive to the shareholders, a lot of whom these days are institutional shareholders, to get the bums out of office in case that hasn't happened already. So I do think that there's sort of a less direct, but I think a possible effect there as well. The only other thing I'd like to say about the Hatch bill, which I saw for the first time this afternoon, is I was sort of frantically preparing for this, is my one concern about the bill is that he says, well, the bill says cases in which the plaintiff has obtained or sought punitive damages. And that suggests that if you lose the first time, for whatever reason, just had bad counsel representing you, but the conduct is bad enough, you sort of lost your one chance to get punitive damages. So the bill, I think, is good, but I would make that change in it. And again, I think punitive damages, it depends on who you ask. If you ask corporations, people who represent them, they are a bad thing. But if you ask people who have been who have been affected by the products, or if you think about the possible deterrent effect, which again could be better, I think you reach a different conclusion.
And now I open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask either Mr. Rudge or Professor Culhane? John?
Professor Culhane first.
I'm not surprised.
Draw your attention to the BMW versus Gore case from 1996.
Right.
For those members of the audience who aren't familiar with that, that was a case where there was damage to BMWs coming off ships, and they repaired the damage to BMWs that did not exceed 3% of the value of the vehicle. There was $4,000 of compensatory damages and $2 million in punitives. The Supreme Court found that to be excessive. Something that was not addressed this evening was the difference that the court made, which is first-time offenders versus second-time, third-time offenders, and whether you would agree to a cap on first-time offenders and maybe have an increment for each time they offend. Would you like to tell that?
I haven't thought about it much, so I'm winging it. My first thought is no, because I think in the vast majority of cases, when you get somebody the first time, you're really getting them for about the 15th time this has gone on. But I think sort of by analogy, because the fairness side of me says by analogy to criminal law, right? You could have somebody who's committed all kinds of crimes and not got caught, and still sort of, let somebody off the first time a little bit easier. So maybe it makes a certain amount of sense. The concern I have about doing that is that, again, you wouldn't achieve enough of an effect of deterrence. And, I have to say, I would be more concerned if punitive damages were going to drive these companies out of business. But as a practical matter, McDonald's case is a good example. Even the very highest level of punitive damages that the jury awarded was only 2 days worth of coffee sales. No jury or court can single-handedly or double-handedly, drive McDonald's out of business or any other such entity. So I guess I'm a little bit concerned about the effects of that. The only other thing I'd like to say with respect to the BMW case is that even though the punitive damages are, hundreds of multiples, I'm not so good at that, thousands of multiples of compensatory damages in that case, the reason the jury picked the number it did was figured out there was a $4,000 reduction in value of the car through this repainting and camouflage job, and then multiplied that, according to the number of times BMW had done this, got figured that way. So all it really did was to take away the profit that BMW had realized in doing this in the first place, which doesn't seem to me to be a bad sort of equitable solution.
Well, a couple of comments. I'll tell you, I can't figure out the relationship between, what was her name, McDonald's, Mrs. Foods or whatever.
Yeah, that's about it. I can't remember either.
And 2 days of profits. Is it 2 days of profits?
Right.
What's the relationship? I don't understand that. I mean, why couldn't it have been 365 days of profits? What relationship is it? And they do that all the time. To get DuPont's attention, you gotta have $1 billion worth of punitive damage. Do they think we're not paying attention with the compensatory damage that are in the case? Getting on the McDonald's case, that was totally ridiculous. First of all, on the warning, what do they expect McDonald's to put on their cups? Coffee is hot. Warning, coffee is hot. And that woman, she was a nice woman, but when she was on John Stossel, she told how the accident happened. First of all, she was in her son's sports Corvette, and she said she got in, and she was reclining in the seat, and she was trying to get the coffee cup off, and it spilled and it scalded her. where's personal responsibility? I mean, we don't know coffee is hot. I don't get into a sports vehicle and try to do that. So, there's no relationship between the conduct and the penalty. Punitive damages are exactly that. They are punishment. There is no deterrence to punitive damages.
I have a question. For Attorney Rudge, going back to the example you gave of the California case with the Playboy clubs, and did you find it problematic because the attorney got such a large fee? And if so, doesn't that have more to do with the nature of class action than it has to do with punitive damages?
Well, I think there's a lot of class action. There's a lot of problems with class action too, but I'm never convinced when some bright attorneys file a class action suit and put in punitive damages. I don't think they're representing all the people at Playboy or that go to those Playboy clubs. I think the people in Playboy clubs, and they pay a certain amount for drinks, probably know they're being overcharged and are happy with it. They're there for maybe other reasons. I don't know what they're in a Playboy club for. But for example, I'm involved in a class action suit in Texas over one of Remington's shotguns. And, these shotguns have performed admirably. I don't think the shotgun owners want to turn it back in their Remington shotguns to do what the plaintiff lawyers are trying to make the suit out of it. And, there's something wrong with both class actions and then putting punitive damages on class action. This case happens to be a case where the shotgun barrel, it's either made out of soft steel or it's made out of hard steel. It's made out of soft steel, and what happens with shotgun owners is they load their own shells so that they can get a real bust out of the barrel. If they overload their shells and you have a soft steel barrel, it peels, okay? Now, if you have hard steel, it'll take a higher overloading, but if you do get it so overloaded with the shell, it shatters and it sends steel in all directions and hundreds of people could get hurt. So we went with the soft steel that peels, but when it's overloaded, it will cause an injury. The basic problem there is people shouldn't overload their shells. We put all the warnings on there. This has got to take 15,000 PSI shell. Don't overload the shell. But you're in a class action. You got all those shotguns out there, punitive damages for your decision. You're probably going to settle that case. And I don't think it deters the conduct. I mean, if we came up to the same thing, we'd probably go with soft steel again.
Professor Culhane, did you want to comment?
I guess I could say a few things. Not with respect to the question, but with respect to what Mr. Rudge said. I guess the jury did deduct in the McDonald's case 20% of the damage from the plaintiff, thinking that was her shared responsibility. So they did sort of factor in that maybe this wasn't the best place to be, uncorking a cup of hot coffee. But maybe she wouldn't have uncorked a cup of hot coffee if she'd known how hot it was. And I do think it makes a difference. If I put my tap on hot, I know it's going to be kind of warm. If I drink a cup of coffee, I know it's going to be hotter, and I behave differently according to those differences. Right? But there's also a difference between coffee that's 140 degrees and 190 degrees. Coffee that's 190 degrees, I would treat like something I had to disarm first. So I might actually respond differently depending on the situation in front of me. And in fact, now the coffee cups I think in McDonald's, because I never eat there or anything, say, caution, coffee extremely hot. Well, that probably is what I should have said in the first place. Piping hot, something like that. I don't know. Too damn hot. With respect, I want to say one other thing, and it's I think important. if you look at punitive damages as a percent of all cases, it's somewhat higher than the product liability medical malpractice figures I gave you. Somewhere in the, depends on the study, 6 to 8% range, which is still very low, right? But the cases in which you find punitive damages are exactly the cases in which you'd expect them. The basic intentional torts, right? The trespassory torts you sort of start first year torts with, assault, battery, people imprisoning each other for no good reason, those sorts of stuff, right? Those kinds of cases. Or cases involving the levels of sort of interference with contract that are tortious. And in order for an interference or breach of contract to be tortious, it has to be really bad conduct. So in those cases, you kind of built in the level of culpability necessary to get punitive damages. So to me, the cases in which you'd expect there to be a high percentage of punitive damage award, you get it. And in cases that are more typically negligence cases, like medical malpractice, product liability, you don't get it. One other point, sometimes, and this is not true of most American corporations, but occasionally a corporation entity should go out of business for its conduct. There's an example of a case in which there was a medical school that wasn't supervising its interns and anesthesiologists, and there were people who were dying as a result. And the lawsuit hit and the place went out of business. No good riddance.
Well,
Bad rubbish or something.
but when you say corporations are going bankrupt, did you ever hear of Dow?
Yeah.
He's a fairly large corporation, wasn't he? Is it chapter 11 or chapter 7?
I don't know the difference. It's a bankruptcy thing.
You should study the breast implant case because it's going to have unbelievable consequences. First of all, if they're wrong, and indeed breast implants don't cause any increased incidence of disease, think of all the women that have had the breast implants taken out. Think of the punitive damages of that you should assert against the plaintiffs for your problems. But they think they're winning. But you know what I found really terrible about what the lawyers in the breast implants did? Is there were about 5 or 6 companies, and these companies were defending 3M was one, which is one of the outstanding innovative companies in our civilization. But these plaintiff lawyers, when all the companies were saying, we're going to win this lawsuit, and punitive damages will not affect our bottom line, they sent out prospectuses to all the pension funds and all the mutual funds, analyzing these 4 companies and showing what will happen if they're wrong. And on that day, for example, 3M stock went down 5 points. You average that over the capitalization of 3M, you're talking about $5 or $6 billion was out of their capitalization. I think that's wrong. I really think that's wrong. And I think some plaintiff lawyers, that's exactly what they want to have happen. They want to bankrupt a corporation. And they do everything possible to put it in runoff.
That doesn't make any sense to me because there's no money to get. They can't get any money that way. That doesn't make any sense to me.
They don't share. They get a lot of money because they don't get it in runoff. They do their best to get it.
John, how much time do we have?
Maybe another 5 minutes if there's another question.
Are there other questions? Yes, Ron.
I have a question for Mr. Rudge, just to get us to the topic of federalism for a minute. I'll leave aside the question of when it is you're going to come to your defense of our civil justice system, which you started off talking about. It sounds to me like you're really not supportive too much of what exists today. But in any event, you made an interesting comment that you believe this was a state law problem and not a federal law problem, although I guess my question there is why? Why, it would seem to me that your interests in terms of effective lobbying, et cetera, would be to push for bills like the one that Senator Hatch is sponsoring, get it all done at the federal level. Why do you believe that it makes more sense to attack this in 50 states as opposed to at the national level?
Well, I went around to Senators Roth and Biden. argued all these points extensively. As Senator Roth said, and I've come to agree with him, probably will rue the day that we allow the federal government to get its nose under the flap of the tent of the justice system. And you know, when you look at where we are in the states, we have won so much in the last 4 or 5 years against the trial bar. There are some states, you know, that don't permit punitive damages. And I would be afraid if we got federalism and we got caps at the federal level, every one of these states would move right up to where the cap is. And, you know, I'm not so sure that's good for us. So
It's essentially it's a strategic position as opposed to a belief that states ought to be the ones responsible for tort.
You know, I happen to be a strong states' rights person, and I would say, you know, the federal government ought to do what the federal government does best and leave the civil justice system to the prerogative of the states. But, you know, it is strategic. It's also a strong belief that, you know, when you get it down to the state level, people make better decisions.
Well, I guess I agree with that, and I think the same kind of logic pushed to the next step would say that it should be courts that have all the information in a particular case that make better decisions about things like punitive damages cast in legislatures, which are considering things in more of a blunderbuss way. So I agree, but I just don't think the point goes far enough.
And let me respond to that point about the civil justice system. And on decision making, it's not bad. Although sometimes I think we could replace the whole court system with a computer and get about the same effective decision. But what I really dislike about the current system is inefficient. It just simply costs us too much to get to that decision. And I'm going to, you know, for the remainder of my career, I'm going to be doing everything possible to improve the efficiency of our civil justice system. I think it's great, probably better than any other alternative I know. I'm not in favor of private courts. I think we're going to private courts because we can't get a good result out of the court system in an efficient way. So we'll go, all of society will always go towards efficiency. And the financial system has done a great job. And I think ultimately the courts will do a great job.
May I follow up with Professor Moulton's question? In the BMW case, I also touched base on this issue, and I know that you have indicated states, and both of you now, states may be the best jurisdiction to battle this issue on. They in the BMW case recognize that this is a federal interest in the Interstate Commerce Clause aspect. And I'm going to quote, while each state has ample power to protect its own consumers, none may use the punitive damages deterrent as a means of imposing its regulatory policies on the entire nation. Would either of you like to respond to that?
No. I'll try. I mean, I guess I read that with some concern because, man, I don't know how seriously the court is going to take that in the damages case. It seems to me that anytime you apply punitive damages, it necessarily, if it's any kind of multinational or even interstate corporation, you are sort of affecting corporation across state lines. So I don't see how that can be avoided. As I recall, the BMW case had a complication to it, which was that there were different state laws that applied respecting whether or not the conduct is in question was allowed. In other words, there was a certain difference in the percent value that a car had to be reduced by before you had to make the disclosure. So I think that was part of the problem in that case, was that the court and the jury didn't give sufficient attention to competing state laws in that situation. I think that's what led the court to make that statement. I read the BMW case about 1.5 years ago, so I'm a little sketchy on it, but that's my recollection of it.
All right, well, I'd like to thank both Mr. Rudge and Professor Culhane.